So this is the fourth lecture for our class, and I'll be talking about chapters 3 and 4 in the Robert book, and this will be for class on October 30th. So the first question has to do with the Edinburgh 1910 meeting. I know it looks like Edinburgh, but it's pronounced Edinburgh. The meeting was very important in terms of missions because it's kind of the high point for optimism. A lot of Christians think they're going to convert the world. It's going to happen finally. It's also meaningful for Christian unity because there's so many Christians gathered from different kinds of Protestantism. And finally, it's important because we kind of see native, non-Western Christians playing a role. Even though there weren't many at the conference, they got kind of a special, they took center stage. They gave a hugely disproportionate number of the messages, showed that it was things were starting to shift towards non-Western leadership, and that missions were starting to recognize that. And probably the most exceptional example of this is a man named V.S. Azariah, who said basically, we need missionaries. We would like missionaries. He's an Indian, a native Indian Christian from the subcontinent of India in South Asia. He said, but don't come as teachers. Don't be paternalistic. Don't talk to us like you're better than us. Just come as friends. We need friends. And his words made a big impact. And it really showed the importance of natives being able to take the lead and the kind of attitude they had, which was warm and welcoming towards missionaries, but not submissive, not subservient. And Technology and youth both made this possible. Technology because it connected the world, and young people because they were kind of key in motivating signing up and this kind of thing. The second question is on the student movement. You can see it's very international. That's the question because the slogan called "Make Jesus King" came from Japanese Christian students. They were gathering all over the world, Europe, North America, Australia, and there also are mission colleges, and Azariah talked at them. Some of them are in Asia, talking about Asians converting Asia. Then also faith missions. I want you to talk about or look into what does it mean to go by faith. I won't spell all this out, but what does it mean? What does it mean to be a faith mission? And what is the international news that encourage Christians to participate in these missions? And part of it is social and political unrest um, that causes them to think that the end is near. And a part of it is also hearing about revivals all over the world. And this encourages kind of non traditional missionaries to participate, including women, including people without qualifications. And then I want you to talk a little bit about William Seymour, people like William Seymour, Harris, Kibangu, Joseph Babalola, Watchman Nee, Witness Lee, Wang Mingdao, John Sung. These are some names I'll give you. You tell me, why are they important? Some examples of African and Chinese Christian leaders. Question 3 asks about Catholics, World War One, and also how non-Westerns began to organize, non-Western Christians. So in the 19th century, basically, Catholics weren't that interested in Christianity. They were interested in kind of a territorial Catholicism, where different Western countries were given territory in the world. Like, this section of the world belongs to France, this section belongs to Spain, and they just work there. But the 20th, I want you to talk about some of these ideas about how they're shifting towards natives or enculturation and other important ideas. Um, in World War One, I want you to talk about how missionaries try to work through it, including some of the difficulties and the New World, kind of how there was an international system, friendship groups, and things that sprung up. I want you to talk about that a little bit, look into it. And then finally, on non Western Christians, talk about how they began to promote a kind of world Christianity, how Asian Christians responded in the war, right, when they met American soldiers, these kind of signs. Women and peasants, how they organized, how Christians around the world were organizing to help kind of underprivileged or starting colleges, all these kind of things. Talk about that a little bit. Look into it. It's on those pages. Then in question 4, why did missions retreat after World War II? This has a lot to do with kind of decolonization in general, and the kind of attacks on Christians and missionaries from this decolonizing movement. Roman Catholics, mainline Protestants, evangelicals, all contributed to the rise of Christianity outside the West for different reasons. Roman Catholics, you can talk about Vatican II. With mainline Protestants, you can talk about the way they partnered with native Christians and built strong organizations for for human rights and other things. And evangelicals, even their increasing, their continued promotion of converting, they still kept a pretty traditional idea of promoting Christianity. They're just three flavors of Christians, and they all continue to do work in missions. But they're all working. Even evangelicals, which are very conservative, you can see the rise of a kind of non-Western Christianity. So if you can study that, that will be helpful. See if you can figure out, give many examples. You just pick one, like women's organizations in Africa, Latin American liberation theologians, Asian Christianities, been indigenizing the religion. I want you to talk about all of that. The specific Asian problem, of course, is Western issues. Sorry about the noise in the background. Then question 5 is David Livingstone. We kind of shift now to this man named David Livingstone. Um, what did he do? What was the purpose of his life? Well, he's a missionary and a doctor. But I want you to talk about why did he do what he did. He lived a very, you could say, strange, atypical life. And his heart is buried in Africa, as he requested. So that should tell you something about him and how he lived and what his purpose is for. Because he was involved, part of his purpose it was Christianity, but it had a political bent. I want you to look into that. How do you feel about slavery? Who was he opposing? Europeans had a mixed reaction. He was kind of a celebrity. I mean, he got a state burial, but at the same time, he received a lot of criticism for being too political, so to speak. What were those politics? And then how do Africans view Livingstone's legacy? You can just look at the little discussion she has, for instance, of the statue of Livingstone by Victoria Falls, which is on the border of Zambia and Zimbabwe. What happens to that statue? Who fights over it? What are the different African responses to it, and why? 6 is asks about why are missionaries so controversial? Do they deserve that reputation? How did the world wars and their aftermath cause a backlash against missionaries? And finally, how have scholars participated in critiques of missions? So, unlike tourists, business people, academics, missionaries explicitly try to change minds. And that causes controversy, of course. If you're trying to change someone's mind, they sometimes don't want their mind to be changed. Or you're trying to engage them at the deepest level of their culture, how they think about things. So even since the first century, the first missionaries like the Apostle Paul and the ones even before him, they've always been criticized for interfering, for getting involved and turning up, kind of stirring up the social order, making problems. And to some extent, they deserve their reputation, right? You can see that they seem to provide the softer side of imperialism. So that one Japanese critic said, the soldiers bring the guns, the missionaries bring the medicine to heal you after you've been shot. So the idea is that missionaries work with colonialism. But at the same time, you kind of have to remember that the missionaries are going out when there's a scientific racism at an all-time high. A lot of people thought people deserve the religions they get. So lesser people can't accept Christianity. There's no point. So in a way, missionaries attempt to change minds is an honor to those people. It gives them dignity. It suggests that they can understand Christianity, that they can make it their own, that they deserve to have the same religion, so to speak, and to make up their own minds. And they're also against, in general, scientific racism. They're much less racist than their European peers at that time. And so the world wars and their aftermath caused a backlash. You can talk about that. Seems like you can see pretty obvious what the effect of the world wars would have on the European reputation. I'll just say that, but you can look into it. It's on these pages. And then how scholars critiqued, how scholars participated. I want you to be able to argue for cultural imperialism and argue against it. Their cultural imperialism seems to make sense, but there's actually some pretty strong arguments against it too. So you can see why it was popular and why it's generally no longer popular to talk about cultural imperialism simplistically. There's still a tie, not to make any mistake. There's still a tie between missionaries, colonialism, imperialism, but it's not so simple. And really here, if you focus on the figure of the native convert, you'll get some idea, or the native preacher, even the native evangelist. You get some idea of why it's difficult to just hold on to a cultural imperialism. 7 is how do indigenous converts and evangelism complicate the criticism of cultural imperialism? Oh, this is actually the one. Sorry. Um, the last question, question 6. The only thing I wanted you to really focus on there actually was this idea of brainwashing, and then this kind of infamous missionary position. You can look at that for some of the kind of poor scholarship, people with an agenda that caused some of our famous critiques of missionaries. the kind of sex position, missionary position, and why that was a misunderstanding. But 7 explicitly deals with this question. So what if you have a native person who's the main cause of Christianizing their own people? How does that complicate this narrative? Arab and Indian scholars have also criticized Christian mission quite bitterly, and some of their points are quite well taken. But there's an irony here. Where are they criticizing mainly when there are a lot of missionaries or not a lot? And what does that show? And then lastly, missionaries have been important in the development of human rights. I want you to talk a little bit about that. They're often the first Europeans to really see the value of indigenous people. How did that create a kind of language and idea of human rights? If we go to 8, we finally see how Catholic missionaries resisted colonialism in Latin America. Talk about people like De las Casas or others, how they were resisting mission, how they were resisting well, not mission, but the kind of abuses of colonialism. And then the Moravians also. All this complicates the picture. This is all one reason why scholars have generally move away from the simplistic idea. Christianity is bad or missionaries are bad. They're forcing things on natives. You can look at Moravians, how they went to the Caribbean islands and throughout the world where there was African slavery, um, and sometimes married indigenous women and also basically shared the conditions of indigenous people converted, and showed that the abolition of slavery didn't have to be violent. I talk a little bit about that. What happened when there was a revolution, when there were violent revolutions, revolts? What did the Moravian Christians, the converts, do? And then evangelicals did not only work in favor of Christianity in terms of abolition slavery, they also changed the attitudes of Europeans, and they also converted Africans themselves, African slaves, African descendants. Why? Why would evangelicalism be appealing to American blacks, right? For an example, literacy. I'll give you one of them. There are actually 2 or 3 other ideas. Evangelicals like literacy. They want to teach people to read, and that was dangerous for a lot of enslaved blacks, because other people didn't want to give them literacy. It's a form of power if they engage in the laws and make reasoned arguments. There was a fear of what they might do. They might organize. They might um, change the system, which of course is partly what happened. But evangelicals liked giving people literacy so that they could read the Bible. And the last question is giving examples of how missionaries have defended human rights. So there are a few, right? We talk about sex trafficking. If you could give specific examples, what countries that's happened. Belgian Congo is a big one, how it finally ended. One of the worst cases of European colonialism and abuse of a colonial empire is Belgian Congo, of today's Congo or Zaire used to be called. And then the Armenian genocide, the rape of Nanking, all these places, Latin America and the Philippines during their dictatorships, the genocide of Cambodia, apartheid in South Africa, any of these will be fine if you can give me any details. Um, Missionary attitudes toward land, you can also talk about how they changed. The general shift away from a feudalistic colonialist idea of land belonging to people and to be exploited by peasants to a kind of modern idea of land needing to be sustainable and needing to enrich people in a careful way. There are reasons why missionaries are tied to the land. They have to depend on it in certain ways. And they're closely related even to ecology. They have come up, one of the extreme cases, you talk about Dorothy Stang, tell her story, how she was killed, and how there are very many different interpretations of her life, from busybody, nosy person, who deserves, who interfered and basically deserved what she got, to really a martyr, a selfless person who gave up her life to help indigenous people and sustain their ecology and environment. So there's a lot here. You can do your own research. You can look at it. I hope I've pointed you in the right way. And that's this lecture.